I nearly had Rob Roy in this set. It's the only one I'm missing. I found it through Aid Books in a bookshop in Italy, and I bought it. It wasn't cheap exactly. The book was cheap. Postage was huge, but they cancelled it. Apparently it wasn't available at all. I guess they just hadn't updated their website. So I'm still looking. It's out there. One day I will have my completed set. In the meantime, I'll carry on with Chapter 47 of Waverley. Chapter 47 taught me a lot about how Scott writes, at least how he writes in this book, how he was writing at this time. Chapter 47 opens on the same night. They wake up after just a few hours' sleep. It's still dark. The village clock in the nearby town strikes 3. The plan is they're going to sneak through the trees in the dark, around the village, and attack the British troops from the other side, where the ground is nice and flat, and it will be easy to do. Fergus and Edward join the prince, who is already surrounded by his principal officers and the chiefs of clan. They have a bit of a war council where they talk about what they're about to do, and then they set off. Each leader hastened to get his men into order with as little noise as possible. This is something the Highlanders excel at. They all get up, they pack up their stuff, and they're on the move. I was going to say they're on the march, but they don't march. They're moving, slipping very quietly through the trees, almost before Edward is aware of it. They moved with astonishing silence and great rapidity. The mist had not risen to the higher ground, so that for some time they had the advantage of starlight, but this was lost as the stars faded before approaching day, and the head of the marching column, continuing its descent, plunged, as it were, into the heavy ocean of fog which rolled its white waves over the whole plain and over the sea by which it was bounded. Some difficulties were now to be encountered, inseparable from darkness. These, however, were less inconvenient to Highlanders from their habits of life than they would have been to any other troops, and they continued a steady and swift movement. And so they reach the lowlands, at which point a British sentry hears them, calls out who goes there, and they don't answer. Fergus whispers, I gather, "Hush, let none answer as he values his life. Press forward." So they continue their march with all the same silence and rapidity. But they can't have been completely silent because this sentry figured out they were there, and now they hear him gallop off to tell his commanding officers that they're there. They're not concerned about this because this isn't actually planned to be a surprise attack. They're moving silently to gain themselves whatever time they can, but not because they really need it, just because it's an extra advantage maybe. The clan of Fergus had now gained the firm ground, which had lately borne a large crop of corn, but the corn had been harvested, so it's just like smooth open field, very easy to travel over. The Highland army now occupied the east end of the wide plain, and it drew up in 2 lines. The first was destined to charge the enemy, the second to act as a reserve. The few horse, whom the prince headed in person, so the prince is on a horse, remained between the 2 lines. He apparently said he wanted to be in the front line, charging in person, but all of the chieftains felt that wasn't a good idea, and that would only impede the common soldiers around him. Both lines were now moving forward, the first prepared for instant combat. The clans of which it was composed formed each a sort of separate phalanx, narrow in front and in depth, 10, 12 or 15 files according to the strength of the following. The best armed and best born, for the words were synonymous, were placed in front of each of these irregular subdivisions. The others in the rear shouldered forward the front, and by their pressure added both physical impulse and additional ardour and confidence to those who were first to encounter the danger. "Down with your plaid, Waverley," cried Fergus, throwing off his own. "We'll win silks for our tartans before the sun is above the sea." The clansmen on every side stripped their plaids, prepared their arms, and there was an awful pause of about 3 minutes, during which the men, pulling off their bonnets, raised their faces to heaven and uttered a short prayer, then pulled their bonnets back over their brows and began to move forward. Waverley felt his heart at that moment throb as if it would have burst from his bosom. It was not fear, it was not ardour. It was a compound of both, a new and deeply energetic impulse that with its first emotion chilled and astounded, then fevered and maddened his mind. The sounds around him combined to exalt his enthusiasm. The pipes played, and the clans rushed forward, each in its own dark column. As they advanced they mended their pace, and the muttering sounds of the men to each other began to swell into a wild cry. And at this moment the sun comes out and dispelled the mist. So the mist vanishes, the vapours rose like a curtain and showed the two armies in the act of closing. The line of the regulars was formed directly fronting the attack of the Highlanders, flanked by cavalry and artillery. They rushed on with a tremendous yell. The rest is well known. So I guess we need to go away and read up on this fight. I do get that the rest probably was well known to his readers, so I shouldn't be too annoyed by that. I'm a bit harsh, really. We do get a little bit of description. The horse, who were commanded to charge the advancing Highlanders in the flank, received an irregular fire from their fusées as they ran on, and, seized with a disgraceful panic, wavered, halted, disbanded, and galloped from the field. The artillerymen, deserted by the cavalry, fled after discharging their pieces, and the Highlanders, who dropped their guns when fired and drew their broadswords, rushed with headlong fury against the infantry. It was at this moment of confusion and terror that Waverley remarked an English officer, remarked as in he saw, apparently of high rank, standing alone and unsupported by a field piece, which, after the flight of the men by whom it was wrought, he had himself levelled and discharged against the clan of McKeever, the nearest group of Highlanders within his aim. Struck with his tall martial figure and eager to save him from inevitable destruction, Waverley outstripped for an instant even the speediest of the warriors, and reaching the spot first, called to him to surrender. The officer replied with a thrust of his sword, which Waverley received in his target, which I presume means his shield, and in turning it aside the Englishman's weapon broke. At the same time, the battle-axe of Dugald Mahony, remember Dugald Mahony? He was the Highlander who sat beside Edward at the lake when they were waiting to cross to Donald the Bandit's cave. At the same time, the battle-axe of Dugald Mahony was in the act of descending upon the officer's head. Waverley intercepted and prevented the blow, and the officer, perceiving further resistance unavailing, and struck with Edward's generous anxiety for his safety, resigned the fragment of his sword and was committed by Waverley to Dugald, with strict charge to use him well and not to pillage his person, promising him at the same time full indemnification for the spoil. Promising Dugald, that is, that he could get all the loot that this guy's carrying, but not yet. So on Edward's right, the battle for a few minutes raged fierce and thick. The English infantry stood their ground with great courage, but their extended files were pierced and broken in many places. In the personal struggle which ensued, the nature of the Highlanders' weapons and their extraordinary fierceness and activity gave them a decided superiority over the others. Waverley observed Colonel Gardner, deserted by his own soldiers in spite of all his attempts to rally them, spurring his horse through the field to take the command of a small body of infantry who, with their backs arranged against the wall of his own park, for his house was close by the field of battle, continued a desperate and unavailing resistance. Colonel Gardner is badly injured. Waverley can see wounds and blood on him. To save this good and brave man became the instant object of his most anxious exertions, but he could only witness his fall. Ere Edward could make his way among the Highlanders, who, furious and eager for spoil, now thronged upon each other, he saw his former commander brought from his horse by the blow of a scythe, and beheld him receive, while on the ground, many more wounds than it would take to kill him. Waverley did come up to him in the end, and Gardner was alive long enough to look up and recognise him. He fixed his eye upon him with an upbraiding yet sorrowful look, and appeared to struggle for utterance. But he felt that death was dealing closely with him, and resigning his purpose, folded his hands as if in devotion, and died. The battle is won The British army has mostly fled, separated and fled or been killed. So the Highlanders are free to just go through their camp and take all their stuff. And they have left all of their artillery and pretty much all of their horses and weapons and food and everything. The Highlanders are now well equipped. The only other thing Scott mentions here is that Bally died here. Balmawhapple, mounted on a horse as headstrong and stiff-necked as his rider, pursued the flight of the dragoons above 4 miles from the field of battle, at which point the people he was chasing turned around and cleaved his skull with their broadswords. Scott says his death was lamented by few, although it was brave of him, foolhardy, but it was brave of him to keep chasing after them. There at the last with Bally was Lieutenant Jinker. That is the quartermaster that Edward was talking to, who was only there because he'd sold him his horses, and he wanted to make sure he either got his money or the horses back. So he's there at the death. He took charge of Bally's horse once Bally had fallen. Lieutenant Jinker bent his eloquence only to exculpate his favourite mare from any share in contributing to the catastrophe. He told him 1,000 times, he said, it was a burning shame to put a martingale upon the poor thing, and Jinker is happy to have her back. And that's the end of the chapter. Except there is a note V, so I'm going to go there now and see what that says. T-U-V. Oh, the death of Colonel Gardner. The death of this good Christian and gallant man is thus given by his affectionate biographer, Dr. Doddridge. Okay, so he was a real man, Colonel Gardner. There you go. He continued all night under arms, wrapped up in his cloak, and generally sheltered under a rick of barley which happened to be in the field. About 3 in the morning he called his domestic servants to him, of which there were 4 in waiting. He dismissed 3 of them with most affectionate Christian advice. They wax eloquent when somebody's dead and they're doing some kind of eulogy, which I presume this is. The army was alarmed by break of day, by the noise of the rebels' approach, and the attack was made before sunrise, but when it was light enough to discern what passed. As soon as the enemy came within gunshot, they made a furious fire, and at that point the dragoons which constituted the left wing immediately fled. The colonel at the beginning of the onset received a wound by a bullet in his left breast, which made him give a sudden spring in his saddle, upon which his servant would have persuaded him to retreat, but he said it was only a wound in the flesh, and fought on, though he presently after received a shot in his right thigh. Everything that Scott said there, I think, is pretty much repeated here. Then there's a bit about what a good man he was. Apparently there's a whole book about him. We're at the end of the chapter. So, my thoughts. I feel like it stops suddenly, as it does. And although there was a little bit there about fighting, I didn't feel that we were in the moment the way we were in the moment when Edward was watching the march, when he was watching all the soldiers come together. I suspect this is because Walter Scott has never been to war. He didn't know what they would be hearing and seeing. And I must admit, that's much easier for us today because, you know, we can watch a movie on TV. There's a lot out there with battle scenes, and we can watch those and put ourselves in the moment and have some kind of idea of the level of the noise and how confusing it must be with everything around you and how it sounds when somebody calls out from a distance. But Scott didn't have that experience. He may have read some books about it. He may have listened to some personal accounts, but it's not the same thing really. And as well as that, he's a very awkward narrator at this point. I'm starting to see more strengths that he has, but he's not a fluent storyteller. He interrupts his own narrative so often with like extra bits that don't need to be there or should come later or should come earlier. So it's hard to get the real feel of a battle. But we did have it, and this is the first time Edward has fought. I do wonder if there's any other fictional battle scenario like this in all of history. Like, all Edward did was try to stop his own side from killing the enemy, which is something that nobody seems to have noticed. which might be because he's not there for his own self. It's his presence. He is the token Englishman here. The fact that he's with him is all that they really need of him. It doesn't matter if he fights or not. That seems to be it. That has to be it. I think if I was a soldier fighting beside him, I'd be starting to wonder where his allegiance really lay. Can you trust this man? That is probably a very good question to take into the next chapter, and I'll carry on. Chapter 48. This chapter is obviously comic relief. It's the right place for it, straight after a battle, straight after all that tension with the walking and the late at night and then all the fighting. It is the place for it. At least it would be if Scott had managed to convey that tension properly. I don't feel that he did. All the same, he's correct to put this kind of chapter here. The Baron of Bradwoodine, returning from the duty of the day, sought the chieftain of Glenaquoich and his friend Edward Waverley. So this chapter is a talk between these three people. Tully has come to ask them the thing that he touched on yesterday when he said there was a matter that was on his mind, but he'd wait till after the battle. That's what he wants to talk to them about now. Fergus had guessed that it was to do with Rose, but actually it isn't. Tully says, well, it was a good victory. He's sorry it was such a poor battle. He would have liked to show off what they could do to Edward, and he couldn't. It was so easy. I'm going to interrupt this here because that's what Scott tells us all the way through. The British forces were afraid, they fled, the cavalry fled, and then the artillery fled, and it didn't matter how brilliantly the infantry stood their ground. Without those other two, they were going to fail. A British troop is designed, as Scott said in the end of the last chapter, to work that way. The different components fit together to make a very strong whole, but if you take one of those components away, then that's a breach in the wall, as it were. The whole structure of the British front is at risk. That's kind of how Scott described it. And therefore, it's because the cavalry were scared, because of that, this whole battle failed. And I would dispute that. Now, Scott wrote this in 1815. We all know how history was written back then. I mean, throughout forever, just about forever, certainly in England. History was a tool for legitimising rule, for rallying the countrymen, for glossing over issues. It's how it was. The writing of history was a way to put things right the way they were meant to be. Now, today we see that as a horrendous thing. That is something you shouldn't do. That means your historians are fake. Your historians aren't doing their job. But in previous centuries, it was just well understood. They were paid to do that. They were paid to put forward a certain history, not to fabricate anything, just to interpret things in the right way and maybe omit certain things or downplay certain parts of it and play up others. And that is what we see in this battle. This is undoubtedly what Scott has read, that's how the battle happened, that is why they failed. History was written by the English. You do hear that history is written by the winners, that is often the case, but history is written by the literate. In these days there weren't so many who were, and that meant that history was written by the British, even if they were the losers of a battle, because they were literate. They were the ones who could put pen to paper and produce an account. The Highlanders were basically operating on oral history at this point. Oral history is just as fallible as written history, of course. But the thing is that here, Scott has taken all the accounts he can of this battle and put it together, but he's writing it from the other side. There's not much about the movements of the Highlanders. There's not much out there about what the Highlanders were doing. I think it's quite likely that they were actually very strong. They were motivated, they were fresh, they were operating under conditions that suited them perfectly. I don't think it's just to do with the training of the Englishmen. I don't think it's just that the horses didn't realise the Highlanders were there because they were hidden in the fog. All those things that come out, all those reasons why it went this way, I don't even think it's necessarily that General Cope was an impossibly bad general. Although we heard earlier how he went up to Aberdeen instead of defending the lowlands, that's kind of written after the fact. That is written after he lost this battle here. And that was the way that history was written. This battle was lost because of all those factors. They weren't trained very well, the fog, the horses were scared, and their general wasn't a good general. So the general had not inspired confidence in his people. They didn't necessarily trust him. That might be true. He was the general. He needs to take personal responsibility for the failure of this battle. And all of that sounds like the way you might rewrite history so that the Highlanders don't come out looking formidable in any way. They could not officially allow the Highlanders to have any merit whatsoever or any skill. They're savages, right? They're rebels. They're misguided. That's what it's all about. So there was no way an English historian could ever write this battle up to make it look like the Highlanders just exercised great skill and won the day just on their merits. But I think that happened. I think that's exactly how it went down. So here's Tully saying, it was a good victory, it's a shame we didn't have more of a fight to show what we could do. And then he goes on to discuss the thing that is worrying him. That is an ancient custom. Apparently there was once a king called Bruce, back in the dim dark ages. Tully recalls an ancient custom whereby the Baron shows his fealty to his king by removing his boots after a battle. It's taken me a while to put those words together because he says it in such a different way. But anyway, that's it. Here he is in whatever position he is in this battle. This is his right and his responsibility now to do this. But he doesn't see how to make it happen. The prince doesn't seem to be aware of this and hasn't called him over to do this. More than that, the prince isn't even wearing boots. The prince is wearing brogues with buckles. All of this is weighing heavily on Tully's mind. Tully takes about 4 pages to mull this over. He talks about how often it's been done in the past and how the custom actually predates Bradwoodine, well and truly predates Scotland even, how it happened way back in the Roman Empire with the Caesars, but then it was sandals and later on it was boots. So it's fair enough. If it's brogues now, it still holds its dignity, even though they're brogues and not boots, which is one thing that was concerning him. And he's thinking, how do I do this? When do I do this? Shall I ask the prince tonight? Is it still an honourable thing if it's brogues? This is his concern. Fergus finds this funny, but he's managing to treat it with all the respect that Tully would like. His bailey has said that he believes the service should only be offered if the prince requests it, but Tully thinks he needs to put himself forward to the prince to let him know that he is there to do this. So that is the other part of it that he's asking Fergus. Should he do this and how should he do this? I deem it safest, with your good favour, to place myself in the way of rendering the prince this service, and to prefer performance thereof. And I shall cause the bailey to attend with a schedule of a protest Wilkie has here prepared. He's going to get the bailey to go forward with a list of things that need to be dealt with, and the bailey is then going to say that Tully is present and ready to take his shoes off. The other concern of Tully at this point is that maybe everybody won't understand this custom and that maybe it will look like he's actually demeaning himself, because this is not something that a baron would do. He would only do this because of this feudal custom that he remembers and he is very fond of. Fergus highly applauded this arrangement, and the baron took a friendly leave of them with a smile of contented importance upon his visage. Long live our dear friend the baron, exclaimed the chief as soon as he was out of hearing, for the most absurd original that exists north of the Tweed. And Edward says, how can you take pleasure in making a man of his worth so ridiculous? Begging pardon, my dear Waverley, you are as ridiculous as he. Why, do you not see that the man's whole mind is wrapped up in this ceremony? He has heard and thought of it since infancy as the most august privilege and ceremony in the world. And I doubt not but the expected pleasure of performing it was a principal motive with him for taking up arms. But I must go to headquarters to prepare the prince for this extraordinary scene. My information will be well taken, for it will give him a hearty laugh at present, and put him on his guard against laughing, when it might be very malapropos. So, au revoir, my dear Waverley. And that's the end of the chapter. And my thoughts? Only the one that I said earlier. There's nothing to say. It was 15 minutes of their time. It's just in there for comic relief. I don't think it's going to play any big part in the story, and so I'm just going to go straight on. Chapter 49. Edward goes looking for that officer, the one who he saved. He was guarded along with his companions in misfortune, who were very numerous, in a gentleman's house near the field of battle. So they've just sort of claimed this house. And I mean house, a gentleman's house, it's big, it's grand, it's like the Bennet house in Pride and Prejudice. It's a proper size house. I think these days we'd certainly call that a mansion, but it was just a house at this time. On entering the room where they stood crowded together, Waverley easily recognised the object of his visit, not only by the peculiar dignity of his appearance, but by the appendage of Dugald Mahony with his battle-axe, who had stuck to him from the moment of his captivity, as if he had been skewered to his side. Edward asks this man if he's been treated all right, and the man says he has. But Dougal's not very happy because he's missing out on all the plundering that the others are doing. Edward promises to reward him very liberally. He asks the man how he is. The man says, "I am not so inexperienced a soldier, sir, as to complain of the fortune of war. I am only grieved to see these scenes acted in our own island." Waverley says, "Another such day as this, and we'll be returned to peace and order." The officer smiled and shook his head. Fergus enters the room and says, "Come, Edward, come along. The prince has gone to Pinkie House for the night, and we must follow or lose the whole ceremony of the Cully-guy." That is, a tully in the boots. He says a few more sentences and finishes with, "So come along, Waverley." "Waverley," said the English officer with great emotion, "the nephew of Sir Everard Waverley?" "The same, sir," replied our hero, somewhat surprised at the tone in which he was addressed. "I am at once happy and grieved," said the prisoner, "to have met with you." "I am ignorant, sir," answered Waverley, "how I have deserved so much interest. Did your uncle never mention a friend called Talbot?" "I have heard him talk with great regard of such a person," replied Edward, "a colonel, I believe, in the army, the husband of Lady Emily Blandeville. But I thought Colonel Talbot had been abroad." "I am just returned," answered the officer, "and being in Scotland thought it my duty to act where my services promised to be useful. Yes, Mr. Waverley, I am that Colonel Talbot, the husband of the lady you have named, and I am proud to acknowledge that I owe alike my professional rank and my domestic happiness to your generous and noble-minded relative." "Good God, that I should find his nephew in such a dress and engaged in such a cause!" "Sir," said Fergus haughtily, "the dress and cause are those of men of honour and birth." "I didn't see this coming, but I'm kind of pleased. If you remember, way back at the beginning, there was that little bit about Sir Everard, how he planned to get married, and he went to his friend who had the 6 daughters, and he picked the youngest one, and she seemed really reserved, and then one of her sisters told that that girl was actually in love with some common soldier. And Everard then went to the girl's father and said, she must marry this man, she's in love with him and she must marry him. And then for the rest of that man's career, Everard bought him a commission in a regiment and has been helping him in his career ever since. Well, that's this man. This man was technically his rival with the Lady Emily, and because Everard is such a nice man, he not only stepped back so they could get married, but made that marriage possible and then helped them along. I really like that he's come back in. I really like that that little detail from early on was there for a reason. To me, that's the way it should be. The things that happen at the beginning should be called back. This is where we start to see Scott's skill. He is not a good narrator yet. He is not fluid. He really doesn't know how to stick in somebody's head enough to describe what they're saying. But He has planned this book quite well, and it's rather cool that he's done that. Colonel Talbot then says he'd like to speak to Edward on a family matter. Fergus says, all right, I'll go ahead. Join me when you finish talking. Edward and this colonel step out into a garden so they can have a private talk. Talbot says, Mr. Waverley, you have this day saved my life, and yet I would to God that I had lost it ere I found you wearing the uniform and cockade of these men. Edward says, in a very, very complicated sentence, they couldn't expect to find him anything else when he was treated so unfairly by his people. Talbot says, I should rather say this is the circumstance most likely to confirm the reports. You're following the very line of conduct described to you. Are you aware of the infinite distress and danger which your present conduct has occasioned your nearest relatives? There has just been a war in Flanders, and that is where Colonel Talbot was. That war has concluded, and he has come back home. He came back to England, and he found Everard and Richard in jail. He used his influence to get them released. So they're back at home, but their situation is still uncomfortable. They're being watched, they're not being trusted, and it's all because of Edward. Talbot then promised Everard that he would come to Scotland to find Edward and bring him back to get him out of all of this mess, not believing he would actually find Edward as part of the Highlander army. So Talbot came to Scotland. He met up with Colonel Gardner. Colonel Gardner had something of a change of heart regarding Edward. Not a complete change of heart, but he felt that maybe there were other circumstances involved that could have explained Edward behaving the way he apparently had. And that gave Talbot hope that he would find Edward just accidentally there and not really involved. But this unnatural rebellion has ruined all. I have for the first time in a long and active military life seen Britons disgrace themselves by a panic flight, and that before a foe without either arms or discipline, and now I find the heir of my dearest friend, the son, I may say, of his affections, sharing a triumph for which he ought the first to have blushed. Why should I lament Gardner? His lot was happy compared to mine. There was so much dignity in Colonel Talbot's manner, such a mixture of military pride and manly sorrow, and the news of Sir Everard's imprisonment was told in so deep a tone of feeling that Edward stood mortified, abashed and distressed in presence of the prisoner, who owed to him his life not many hours before. He was not sorry when Fergus interrupted their conference a second time, and Fergus has come because the prince wants to see Edward. Doesn't come up in this chapter. I suspect the prince wants to interrupt this conversation between them. I think the prince seems to have a fair idea of Edward's personality, which isn't to say that Fergus doesn't either, but Fergus doesn't really let on, and Scott doesn't really tell us anything about Fergus's views, although Fergus is very careful to keep Caleb beg with Edward, so I guess Fergus does too, really. But anyway, the prince has sent him and Edward has to leave. Fergus leaves instructions that Talbot is to be treated with the greatest of care and watched all the time because the prince says he's an important prisoner. And so they head off to find the prince. And that's the end of the chapter. I feel like I'm not pulling much out of these chapters. They're not really full chapters, like they're not a scene of action from start to end. Scott is a little bit too obvious in his words when he's describing people who we're meant to like and people we're not meant to like. Like the language he used to describe Donald the Bandit, for instance. It was enough to tell us that we're not meant to like Donald. And the words he's using to describe Colonel Talbot here are very much telling us that Colonel Talbot is somebody pretty cool. He does stop short of actually just telling us that. But the language he uses it makes it too clear as far as I'm concerned. Apart from that, though, I'm prepared to like Talbot if he shows himself to be likeable. The one thing I'm not liking here, I guess it's just what you'd expect of Edward, is here we are, we've had this battle, and, Edward has this habit of just jumping into the middle of everything that's going on and never thinking that maybe he's not meant to be there. As a reader, at this point, I would like to know what the prince thinks right now. I would like to know what they're doing. Are they resting? Are they celebrating? Are they sitting down making further war plans? Like, what are they doing? We could learn a lot about the person commanding this army right now if we knew what he was doing. Was he feeling like this was a done deal, or has he just leaped into the next stage? If he has leapt into the next stage, then I have a lot more faith in him than if he's just sitting back chilling. It is good to know what's happening back in England. I'm not surprised by that, even though Edward is. I was surprised that Edward just went into this building to talk to this guy, like, without feeling... It's not that I want him to feel ashamed. It's not even that I think he necessarily should, but I feel like it's a bit awkward, isn't it? To be an English person, to have been in a British army, to be on the other side of that so soon after he was a serving officer, and to just go in to talk to a kidnapped English officer as if he just expects the officer will treat him like a friend. And it's Edward all over, I suppose. But here we are at page 317, and Edward still has the power to surprise me. I still don't fully understand where his head's at. I get that he might have felt taking up the Highlander cause was the right thing to do after all the stories he had in his childhood. But I don't think there was anything in those stories about just jumping from side to side, about being equal friends with both sides. I think all of them had, one was your friend, one was your enemy. Edward has no notion of enemies. He's like a puppy dog. He just thinks everybody is his friend. And so I'll leave it there.